Hello and welcome back to Tinker Talks Guns. Today we're going to talk about the Compact Off-Duty Police, or COP 357 Magnum Derringer, a relic of the 80s, and interesting gun. Before we dive into that, I'd like to say thanks to my supporters on Patreon. Weapons, ammunition, reloading components, etc. This all costs money, and your contributions help more than you know. I'd also like to thank channel benefactors like the local collector who allowed me to fire this weapon and present it to you all. I'd also like to thank Rain City Shooting Center, who provided the .38 special ammunition used in this test. Mostly because I let them shoot it, and they liked that. So anyway, let's talk about the 1980s. In the 1980s, most police officers carried an all-steel revolver as their duty weapon. Many of these were chambered in .357 Magnum, which will also shoot .38 Special. Excuse me. For an off-duty gun, options were not as great as they are today. We live in a golden age of concealed carry pistols, trust me on this. The most popular off-duty weapon probably was a 2-inch J-frame .38 or a 2-inch K-frame .38 with a host of smaller caliber semi-autos taking up the slack. Guns like the PPK, and all of these guns were, except for the airweight Smith & Wessons, most of these guns were heavy by today's standards. And also, .38 Special was being found rather lacking as a defensive round for police officers. Hollow points in the early 80s did not work well, and they didn't tend to be reliable. And so, more power is better, was the thought. And that brings us to the Compact Off-Duty Police, the COP 357, which was conceived as an off-duty and backup pistol. It is a derringer-type weapon. It uses a rotating hammer face that incorporates the firing pin that has a ratchet assembly, so every time you pull the trigger, it rotates the hammer nose 1/4 of a rotation, so that it will strike each of the 4 barrels in turn. And there's a latch to open it up, which I'll show you in greater detail on the tabletop. And it holds 4 rounds of .357 Magnum. And even compared to other concealment offerings of the day, this is not a lightweight pistol. It's all stainless steel, and unloaded it weighs 27.7 ounces, comparable to a Glock 19 today. And it is significantly more compact, but it is quite a chunk of metal. And yes, people were used to heavier guns then because polymer guns were not a thing. But it's also rather thick, and a full inch thick. And it's an interesting idea that in practice did not work out as well as I'm sure its inventors hoped. And after firing, of course, the extractor only moves about 1/10 of an inch. So it gives you just enough room to get a fingernail under the empty cartridge to remove it. So let's go to the tabletop and have a closer look at this beast. So the COP is a relatively compact gun. It's 5.5 inches long and about 4 inches tall. And this very, very long trigger is double action only, and it's too heavy to measure on my Lyman trigger gauge. I'm guessing 15 or 16 pounds. And this was viewed as a safety measure. Now, the sights are at least very visible. Very easy to pick up a sight picture with this. And since it was envisioned to be used at very close range, they seem adequate for the job. And it is very nicely made, very precise machining, and very well put together. And since it was at the time a fairly expensive gun, that seems appropriate. It's all very nicely rounded, so it's not going to snag on a pocket. And you've got a good beaver tail. You've got a lot of roundness and a nice chunky grip to keep hold of, which, as you might imagine, is pretty necessary in a small gun firing a cartridge as powerful as a .357 Magnum. And so the rear sight slides to the rear to open the gun, and as shown previously, the extractor pops up, and it will go back in when the weapon is closed. And yes, it is a bit of a pain to fish the cartridges out after they've been fired. 38 specials will generally drop free. .357, they don't stick, but you have to pull them out manually. So you're not really going to reload this in the middle of a fight. The barrels are rifled, as they must legally be, but that rifling is practically straight in this shorter barrel, and as the shooting showed, pretty ineffective. Half to 3/4 of the rounds I fired keyholed hit the target sideways because they weren't stable, and that really does nothing to enhance the accuracy of this pistol. Now, the trigger pull is very straight, it's reasonably smooth, but it's extremely heavy. And of course, in the fashion of a double action revolver trigger, the reset is far, far out. So rapid firing this gun is limited not merely by recoil, but by the extremely heavy trigger. The grips are plastic and nicely made. The gun feels pretty good in the hand. And given the understanding of stopping power available to them at the time, being able to take your 125 grain jacketed hollow points out of your duty revolver, stick them in this and put it in a holster, a concealment holster, was arguably not the worst idea in the world. But it wasn't a good idea. The gun is heavy, recoil is quite noticeable with .357 Magnum. It's not painful, but it is jarring, and it does kind of cripple your ability to place backup shots, follow-up shots with any real precision. Something that has even more of an effect is the fact that the barrels are not registered. A multi-barrel weapon like a double rifle, the barrels are what's called registered, meaning that they shoot to the same point of impact at a specific range, usually 100 yards. These are not registered. They hit more or less in a circle, or a square rather, around the front sight. But firing carefully and diligently, and doing the best I could with the double action trigger, I was able to produce a palm-sized grip at 3 yards. And yes, it is a close-range weapon by intention, but that's not a good group at 3 yards. And one of the things you give up with this gun is the ability to place your hits precisely. You trade that for power and the compact form. And this was not felt in general to be a good trade, so the guns were not a success. They were produced from 1983 to 1989, and American Derringer produced it very briefly in 1990. There was a smaller version called the Mini Cop, chambered in .22 Winchester Magnum, which was similarly unsuccessful, probably for a lot of the same reasons. In this day and age, we have our pick of tiny 9mm and 380s that are more than half a pound lighter than this gun. This seems utterly daft. In context, in the 1980s, when there were no polymer frame guns, until, the Glock came in, it still seemed a little daft. But not as crazy as it seems today. And even then, with its limited capacity and extremely heavy trigger pull and utter lack of accuracy, there are good reasons that it never really caught on. The miracle isn't that they went out of business, it's that they lasted from 83 until all the way till 89 with a gun that's whole concept is fundamentally flawed. But it is neat. It is a hoot to shoot, not the least because of the basketball-sized muzzle blast. And in 38 Special, it's actually quite pleasant to shoot, despite the very, very heavy trigger. And again, the trigger is ridiculously heavy, but it's smooth and it moves straight back. And it is not as great an impediment to accuracy as you might think. That's mostly down to the fact that the barrel's point of impact is almost random compared to the sight picture. But it's still an interesting gun. And, you know, once I showed it to the guys at the range, everyone wanted to shoot it. So, it has a certain bizarre cachet. It's pretty cool, despite being nearly useless. Anyway, so if you're still watching the video, you probably liked it. So please take 5 seconds out of your busy life to hit the like button. It really helps the channel. So stay safe, take care, and we'll talk to you again real soon.